This podcast is about correcting the balance, whether it's something celebrated as good when it shouldn't be, or the other way around. Or maybe the heroic tales of history just need to be knocked straight on their ass. Me, I just want to share the complete picture, because that's when this whole thing gets fun. Warning, jokes and sarcasm may ensue. Welcome to Prick the Balloon. Hi, I'm Mike Vance, and welcome to Prick the Balloon Quickie Episode 2. So for those of you who promised themselves that after the first PTB Quickie, you'd never debase yourself again, well, here we are, right back in that cheap motel room of knowledge and truth. The Voting Rights Act passed in 1965 for very good reasons. The 15th Amendment extended the right to vote to African American men in February of 1870. But if you think that was the end of the story, then I've got 26 hours of stupid-ass Brooklyn Bridge jokes compiled into a handsome leather volume to sell you. Just because something is the law doesn't mean people follow it. It doesn't mean police enforce it, and it doesn't mean the courts pay attention to it. If it did, there would be no murders in this country, and Lord knows the orange goon would be bent over a stainless steel prison toilet by now. As the United States Constitution goes, the 15th is an amendment that is short and to the point. A few of the amendments have been open to endless court cases and misunderstanding. In the case of the Second Amendment, radical righties and many others have decided to just delete the entire first part to make it fit their needs. Well, the 15th is not that, though. It's pretty straightforward. Section 1 says, quote, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." End quote. There is a second section which is even more brief. Quote, "The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." End quote. For freedmen in southern states that were unrestored to the Union, meaning they still had to get a little more shit together before they started sending representatives back to Congress, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867 had already authorized the Army to register black voters, and it unleashed white efforts to stop them. Elections under American democracy have been, let's say, rustic, contentious, overly convivial, and more. Since the days of George Washington, kegs of beer or whiskey were rolled out at polling places by one candidate or the other, and voters were expected to drain a few drams, courtesy of the politician who carried their interests. You voting for Johnny over there? Well then, let's pound a few shots before you hand in your ballot. That still sounds like a good idea. There were also political machines. New York City's Tammany Hall was the most famous because, well, it was in New York. It allied itself with thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine by openly supplying needed help and services in return for loyal votes. See my cousin Seamus down at Precinct 4, and they might have room on the city payroll for another wee copper. Don't forget to vote for Big Jim a few times come November. For all of the regular hijinks, though, outright violence in the run-up to election days was relatively rare. That changed completely following the Civil War. All of the guys who served in the Confederate military were required to swear an oath, renouncing their treason to the United States and accepting the emancipation of the enslaved before their citizenship could be restored. They swore to it. Most of them said, "Sure, fine, whatever you say." And then, Bob's your uncle. They had regained the right to vote, and they were well on their way to total rationalization. But with the enfranchisement of black men and newly arrived carpetbagging Yankees or recently returned Southerners with Union sympathies, and yes, there were thousands more of those than most history books include, all of a sudden you got this formidable competition at the ballot box. This is not Yordan Alvarez against Oakland pitching. It ain't Reagan invading Grenada. You got yourself a horse race, hoss. Here's the thing about chattel slavery, and why what happened to Africans in the Americas was different than when people try to talk about indentured servitude as being the same thing. It is not. Do you know what a will or deed said about a female slave when she was sold or bequeathed? It said something along the lines of, "I convey Molly and all her increase." increase. That meant all her future children. That was the legal word, and it literally meant that you were increasing your number of enslaved humans. So you enslaved not just the people living down at those cabins behind the big house, but all of the future generations of their children. After a while, the white folks up in the big house started to get outnumbered. Well, when the Civil War came along, whites in Mississippi and South Carolina were in the minority. More than 50% of the population in those states were enslaved. In Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, and Alabama, it was more than 43%. In Virginia and Texas, it was more than 30% overall, but in certain counties it was over 50%. So when Whitey, who had controlled everything so neatly before the war, all of a sudden realized that those people they'd been whipping can suddenly vote, and they are the majority, well, Whitey done soiled their stiff cotton drawers a titch. The sweet irony was that the places with the highest black populations were the ones that had the biggest plantations growing sugar and cotton. That upended demographic brought a wave of former slaves into elected posts across the South. In the 1870s, there were freedmen who became sheriffs and congressmen, state legislators, and even the governor of Louisiana. And surprise, surprise, with that came a prolonged and brutal campaign waged by unreconstructed rebels to put a stop to that shit. There were hundreds of cases in the formerly rebellious states that would have warranted a federal investigation, but it was the Washington County election outrage of 1886 from Texas that finally made it to the halls of Congress. In the census of 1860, the last done prior to emancipation, the 4 Texas sugar-growing counties of Brazoria, Fort Bend, Matagorda, and Wharton held the largest percentage of enslaved Africans in the state. Several other counties, including Washington, either had a slight majority of slaves over whites or were virtually equal. When the war ended and Union soldiers occupied the South, well, those newly freed people had at least a modicum of protection, though all you have to do is read official records to see that many hundreds of Texas blacks, and elsewhere in other states, were murdered by whites in the 4 years after emancipation. Once the Freedmen's Bureau and the U.S. Army troops left the state at the start of the 1870s, all bets were off. Your lunch money was jangling in your pockets, and your big brother was nowhere in sight. The Republican Party had never been a thing in the South before the Civil War, but suddenly, with a mass of freedmen and loyal Union men ready to utilize their new vote, the former Confederates found themselves in the minority. In Washington County, Texas, the numbers were with the Republicans throughout the 1870s. Those new voters created some fiery black politicians, including a guy named Matthew Gaines, who came to the Texas Senate, and a dozen freedmen held elected offices in Washington County, Texas. Whatever reaction you're imagining that brought from the former masters, the reality was probably worse. There was this organization that sprung up to serve the interest of the Republican coalition, and it became really strong really quickly. It was called the Union League. In Washington County, it was headed by a guy named Benjamin Watrous, a freedman who was attacked and wounded while registering voters in 1867. Some of the League's meetings drew crowds of 2,000 supporters in a county that only had 12,000 people overall. The effects of winning elections were real. The county started putting freedmen on juries beginning in 1877. It was this little glimmer of hope that maybe there would be some real equality and maybe things would someday be all right. Yeah, you know that didn't happen. In most places across the South, this whole thing came to a crashing end about that same time of 1877 because of the deal cut over the election of 1876 and the end of U.S. Army troops enforcing the law in the South. But certain counties in all these recently traitorous states were holdouts, and one of those was Washington County, Texas. In 1884, the radical righty former Confederates, who then made up the Democratic Party, won most every race in the county. They benefited from focused racism that congealed amidst outcries against, quote, corrupt Negroes, end quote, in power. If they'd known the term crime family, you bet your bottom dollar they had been using it on the Gilded Age version of Twitter. In the episode on liberal Texas, I talked about the mostly agrarian People's Party, and they were also muddying the waters in 1884. They completely opposed the very wealth and privilege which the Democrats represented. But the old master class lured some of them over by preaching racism. Then there was this group of lily-white Republicans who were for the Union, but increasingly against having their party dominated by the freedmen. Again, plain old racism. And just in case their return to power was ever in jeopardy, the ex-Confederates of Washington County also employed violence, murder, and intimidation to lower black turnout. There was one more element amplified in Washington County. There was this really large German immigrant population. Though some of the guys had followed the local flow, most had been very much against secession and slavery. They also brought with them this distrust and dislike of planter elites in Germany, and they readily applied that to the same group of masters in Texas. The Germans in the county's rural areas voted Republican, and they supported the Socialist Farmers Alliance and the People's Party movements, but the Democrats actively kissed up to that voting bloc in 1884 and got enough of them to come over to win the election for the first time in 15 years. In 1886, the Republicans fielded a full slate of candidates for local, state, and congressional elections. They were planning on taking everything back. They still had the numbers on their side, so why the hell not, right? By all accounts, their efforts were well organized, and both parties expected a close election. It's just that the Democrats, those ex-Confederates, had no intention of letting that happen. The county judge, which is the top county official under Texas law, was a dude named Lafayette Kirk, which would be a completely bitchin' name if it weren't for the fact that he was a total shit excuse for a human being. Kirk was standing for re-election, and he sent telegrams to a bunch of local men, his supporters, we'll call them his posse, that said, quote, "Things look doubtful here, do your work," end quote. And that's what they did. In a little community called Grayball, where blacks outnumbered whites 5-1, the precinct returns were being tallied in somebody's house when a group of disguised and armed white dudes broke in. By disguised, I likely mean hoods. Polk Hill, a black sharecropper with another great name, opened fire with his shotgun. He hit one of the Klansmen in the head. Killed him dead. The dead white man was named DeWeese Bolton, who was the son of a Democratic county commissioner candidate. 8 blacks were arrested for the killings, and 3 of them hauled from jail in Brenham, the county seat, and lynched without a trial. Not surprisingly, the Texas press defended Bolton as, quote, "inoffensive," end quote, and called the lynchings simple hangings. Shaking it here, boss. Other armed hooded men took all the paper ballots from the Grayball precinct and burned them. 7 miles away from there, at Lott's store, which is just what it sounds like, a polling place inside the community store, Republicans tallied 156 votes for their ticket out of a total of 189 votes cast. The tally sheets were sent to the county seat at Brenham, but armed men intercepted and destroyed them. Local officials could not locate the attackers. No idea who they might have been or where they might have gone, so let's just grab a beer, why don't we? In Chapel Hill, one of the biggest towns in the county, where 3 Republican election officials had been cold-bloodedly murdered during the previous campaign of 1884, the precinct judge closed the polls and allowed no one to vote at all. He claimed he couldn't find enough competent election judges. At Independence, another decent-sized town, the election judge there refused to count special diamond-shaped ballots the Republicans were using for illiterate voters, even though the Texas Supreme Court had upheld their legality only a year earlier. County Judge Kirk backed the decision to discard all of the Republican votes at the town of Independence. 3 of the losing Republican candidates, knowing full well that they wouldn't find satisfaction through state or local channels, filed a request for an investigation by Congress. One of them was a guy named Carl Schutze, the Republican German immigrant candidate for county judge, who was running against Lafayette Kirk. The Congress, controlled by Republicans, jumped right in. They held a hearing. Sitting Texas Senator Richard Koch and former Texas Governor John Ireland both testified that the complainants were, quote, propertyless troublemakers, end quote, and swore that no such violence had taken place and no Klan-like organization existed. Koch's testimony ignored the obvious fact that the three who filed the federal complaint were without property because they had been forced to flee the county at gunpoint, the gun barrels of white terrorists. Koch, who stands out as an egregiously slimy person even among the litany of pond-scum Texas politicians, tried to blame the Republicans for attacking their own polling places. Others blamed northern agitators. Furthermore, the avowedly racist Koch said the federal government had no standing to interfere in a Texas election. Pay yourself a nickel if that sounds at all familiar. Several dozen Washington County residents went to the nation's capital to testify, and the resulting report was over 700 pages. Yet when Senate Democrats, led by the two Texans, filibustered against reform, the Republicans in Washington failed to pass a national bill to ensure fair elections. The U.S. Attorney in the Western District of Texas brought Washington County's Democratic Judge Lafayette Kirk and several of his cohorts to trial in Austin's federal court, but with white juries, there was first a mistrial and then an acquittal. Ex-Governor Ireland was one of the defense lawyers, and Senator Koch sat at the defense table yucking it up with the defendants. I'd say picture Ted Cruz doing that, but we all know Ted Cruz has no sense of humor. Several Republican office holders, black and white, in Washington and other Texas counties were forced to move away after threats and violent intimidation, and the party pretty much disappeared from Texas for the better part of a century. For decades, in most statewide elections, Republicans never made it out of single digits. And that all comes from the 1884 election. And that, friends and enemas, is why legislation like the Voting Rights Act is so important. Okie dokie, that's Prick the Balloon Quickie 2. The next episode will be back to full length, and if this happens to be your introduction to Prick the Balloon, please catch up with the old episodes via whatever podcast source you favor. One reminder, find the podcast page on my website at mikevancewriter.com, where I have reading suggestions for those full-length episodes. Thanks for listening. Be sure to check out my website at mikevancewriter.com. Prick the Balloon is copyrighted by Mike Vance, all rights reserved.